Right, so as a Labour conference has kicked off, for once the focus is on Keir Starmer. He's being put under the microscope and getting the questions himself. But if he'd hoped for a puff-piece interview with Laura Kuenssberg this morning, ending up face-to-face with Victoria Derbyshire must have seen the blood drain from his face. Derbyshire didn't disappoint either, not that she had to try particularly hard to have him flapping harder than a line-caught flounder. Keir Starmer is determined his Labour government will see the economy grow, despite putting no public money in to make it grow, to invest in it. Yet, when asked the very relevant question, what if it doesn't grow, he just fell to bits. This guy doesn't know what he's doing, needs his hand held at all times, and when that support isn't there, he's like a rabbit caught in headlights, and his cluelessness got rapidly exposed this morning. Right, so Labour conference has begun, and as you can imagine, for a Starmeroid critic like myself, I'm a socialist, so of course I am, because he's a red Tory. There's no shortage of things I could talk about, but being a Sunday morning as this is, the media rounds being done at conference, Starmer was on the Laura Kuenssberg show this morning, though unfortunately for him, he wasn't facing Kuenssberg, but got Victoria Derbyshire instead. Good stuff, he might get asked something relevant for a change, I thought. Well, Derbyshire chose to answer him on economics as part of her interview. Not Starmer's forte particularly, he relies heavily on Rachel Reeves in moments like this, and given his responses, it wasn't hard to see why that is. Derbyshire put to him, "You've pledged that you're not going to borrow for day-to-day spending in the NHS and on schools, social care, other public services, because as you've said this morning a number of times, the way to fund public services is through growth. If you don't get that growth, that means there will be no money or extra money for public services, correct?" It's a fairly standard sort of a starter question, isn't it? It's okay to want to do things a certain way, but what if your ideas don't work? What will you have to do differently? What's your plan B? Well, Starmer clearly didn't have one, given his response, because he said, "I'm confident we can get the growth. That's why we have worked through a plan that tells you how we can get the growth, the people we need, the skills that we need. We've set out a policy on skills just this morning to get the skills in the right area. The partnership with business, this is crucial. This will not be state control. It won't be pure free markets. It will be a partnership with business. What businesses say to me is that they need stability. They need that platform. There are plenty of investors who are absolutely clear in their discussions with me, and they say we will invest in the UK if the circumstances are right. But at the moment, because of this government, there's too much chopping and changing of minds and chaos, and they are holding off from investment. We have to create the conditions for the growth in this country." Right, so Starmer's entire plan for economic growth is to effectively put public services, everything actually that needs funding, up for tenure to the highest bidder then. Instead of funding things via the public purse as a country in control of its own assets does, Starmer wants business to foot the bill instead. But in exchange for what? What sort of a price tag for the rest of the NHS then? Those private health donations seem to be quite the investment at this point, don't they? Let's have more of that, he says. When Starmer ran to be Labour leader, he said he'd renationalise stuff. We know that's a long since abandoned promise now, but who knew his real intent was to actually privatise even faster than we ever have before? Because unless business is getting something, why would it bother to invest? Business needs certainty, he keeps saying. This is apparently why he won't renege on those oil and gas licences Sunak has granted in the North Sea. But it seems to be the economic plan for everything. Factually, you can print money, invest it in people who will spend it in the economy, and the economy will prosper as a result. Instead, it seems Starmer is putting a price tag on the UK for stuff to run. Privatisation has always failed. We know this. We see it every day. All the things now failing since Thatcher thawed them off. Water, energy, mail, all the rest of it. Starmer sounds like he'll sell anything that isn't nailed down in order to get the investment cash to run things. Therefore, it would only be a matter of time before everything ends up failing then, surely, just like all the other privatised services that we've seen over the last several decades. The entire economy. Unless he wakes up to that not being a very good idea, that it doesn't work, and changes tack. So let's sincerely hope there is a plan B then, because he didn't mention one in his little speech there. Well, Victoria Derbyshire noticed that as well, as she came back with, "Let me come back to my question, if I may. If you don't get that growth, that means there will be no extra money for public services." Yes, she's not letting that one go. Try again, Keith. "I'm confident that we will get the growth. If you don't, It is the single defining mission of a Labour government. I've set out 5 missions, 5 purpose-driven things that we will go for over 5 and 10 years. Well, Derbyshire had given him ample opportunity to answer the question. She'd let him run freely up until this point. But now the interruptions had to begin. He wasn't answering her question. He wasn't doing so. He's brought up his 5 missions, the latest 5 that he hasn't broken yet, and picked him up on one in particular, saying one of them is the highest growth in the G7. Everything else hangs off that. To which Starmer replied, it is the central one. It's not just one of them. This is the central mission of an incoming Labour government. It's interesting that he's prioritised that one over the other 4, though. More important to outdo other countries economically than fix the NHS, make our streets safe, break down barriers to opportunity, and make the UK a clean energy superpower, as he's also pledged to do. But then, by the sounds of things, all of those things are going to be put on the market to be delivered, and as a consequence of that, we'll see higher growth. That seems to be the economic thinking here. Higher than any other country in the G7, despite the fact we have no control or impact on the economies of any of the other G7 countries. It's not the central pledge. It's a really, really stupid one. It's one he has no control over delivering. And he's now stood up and said, this is the most important bit. There is one important detail missing here, though. He still hasn't answered Victoria Derbyshire's question. Starmer said everything else hangs off that, to which Derbyshire replied, absolutely. And what if you don't get it? Starmer's answer, I'm confident that we will. Well, if he doesn't, by selling the country off, there's no plan B, apparently. He's confident because he's listened to businesses and basically heard their demands and said, well, OK, we'll give you what you want. Well, what will that look like then? Well, look at Labour conference as a for instance. Labour members are making up just 22% of the attendees there. Business, 28%. Martin Lewis, the money-saving expert fella, put out a tweet of concern yesterday when it became apparent who some of the sponsors who are sponsoring events at Labour conference are. One of whom turns out to be a buy now, pay later company, a lender, which charges an APR of some 64.5% interest, who were there sponsoring the London Regional Party event, and whose founder was given a platform to speak against regulation of their industry. Starmer's idea of economic prosperity is to spend absolutely nothing, just invite in investors and seemingly promise them whatever it takes to deliver on the things that we all need and the services we all rely on, based on his nothing more concrete than his own self-belief. He'll flush the country down the toilet rather than admit he's wrong, even if it gets proven to be the case, as seems certain. What do you think of Starmer's economic ideas? All a bit Blairite, all a bit Tory? Or do you think more privatisation is the way? In which case, convince me, because you won't find an example of it ever having worked before. Have your say in the comments below and be part of the conversation. As always, thanks for watching. I hope you found the video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where he came out with not one but 2 examples of two-facedness ahead of Labour conference on the subject of saving the NHS, did our Keith, i.e. he's not going to save it. And I'll hopefully see you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so the Palestinian plight at the hands of the apartheid state of Israel is back in the news. But as always, the framing of it is completely one-sided, historically ignorant and frankly inexcusable. We condemn Russia for invading Ukraine, but the same has been happening for far longer in the Middle East. So why is it we're picking and choosing whether to side with the oppressed or the oppressor in both cases, making the entire Western world look like a bunch of hypocrites? What our mainstream talking heads should be asking is why the escalation by Palestine and Hamas now? And the simple short answer is, you've ignored them whilst trying to find a peaceful resolution, whilst they have been seeking a peaceful resolution. But now they've got your attention in brutal terms, because that is what it has taken for the wider world to once again look at this situation in the Middle East that has rumbled on actually for well over a century, and isn't going to end without some kind of a peaceful intervention. But when the global community keep positioning themselves on one side of this, and the wrong side of it at that, what hope have they got unless more of us start to call it out for what it is? Right, so first and foremost, I want to begin by briefly going over the history of how things have got to where they are, but I can't do that without first making it abundantly clear that all of the harm caused and the lives lost in this most recent course of events on both sides must be condemned, and I absolutely do. It is a sad state of affairs, however, that things have got to this stage, before people pay attention to what is happening there again. And if anyone at this point goes, yeah, but do you condemn Hamas? You're being led by the nose by our pathetic press and don't appear to be capable of a critical thought of your own. You probably need to watch this video more than most. Okay, so back in the 1880s, Zionist Jewish settlers began settling in Palestine, and by the early 1900s were a fairly significant political movement. And after the Balfour Declaration in 1917, became all the more so with British support then for the establishment of a Jewish state within Palestine. So we here in the UK have a significant role in what happened then, right up to what is happening now. Tensions rose, and by 1947, the UN were pushing for partition in Palestine, establishing two states, one for Arabs, one for Jews. The Jewish leaders accepted this, the Palestinians rejected it because they felt it unjust and would result in them being displaced from their own lands, which frankly has been happening from the get-go since the Zionist movement moved over there. They were ignored though. The UN passed the partition plan and Israel declared its independence on the 14th of May 1948. And within hours of that happening, neighbouring Arab countries like Egypt and Syria declared war on Israel to try and prevent that partition plan. It entirely backfired, it failed, resulted in hundreds of thousands of Palestinians being displaced, forced to flee their homes, as Israeli soldiers initiated massacres of unarmed civilians and intimidation to make them go, driven out at gunpoint. By the end of the conflict, more than 750,000 Palestinians had been displaced and 500 of their villages had been erased from the face of the earth. This was the Nakba. The word literally translates as catastrophe. It gets commemorated on the 15th of May every year, the day after Israeli Independence Day, for this reason. It was a deliberate policy of ethnic cleansing that has continued to this day. For the first 8 months of 2023, incidentally, settler violence towards Palestinians has increased at a rate of 3 attacks per day. So is it any wonder that in the face of a global blind eye being turned to all of this, that violence has once again broken out? Of course, now that the world is looking again, they've just continued where they've left off. Keir Starmer, we'll start with him. His statement on this is typical of the attitudes of so many. He said, I utterly condemn the ongoing attacks on Israel and her citizens. There is no justification for this act of terror which is being perpetrated by those who seek to undermine any chance for the future peace in the region. Israel has a right to defend herself. Hold on a minute, Keith. You haven't sided with Russia in the war with Ukraine. Ukraine, like Palestine, is defending itself against an aggressive larger force, so what gives? Oh, of course, you're a Zionist without qualification, aren't you? Imagine if Ukraine carried out a drone strike on Moscow and killed or injured hundreds of people and Russia swore to come down on Ukraine like a ton of bricks. Would you hear these same leaders coming out and expressing solidarity with Russia right now? Don't be daft. Starmer and his ilk don't acknowledge that Israel is doing anything wrong, unlike Russia, despite the fact both are occupying or wannabe occupying forces. So your opinion is not borne out by logic or facts, just your opinion. And actually, this is symptomatic of the rest of our political class and every rancid media narrative going right now. The Tory government has called for the Israeli flag to be flown from all government buildings in solidarity. EU President Ursula von der Leyen put out a tweet saying, today, Hamas terrorists have struck at the heart of Israel, capturing and killing innocent women and children. Israel has the right to defend itself. Today and in the days to come, the European Union stands with Israel. Suella Braverman, you might have guessed she'd have said something, wants the police to crack down on Hamas support. But the article carrying that story, The Guardian, it's the paper who had published it, who carried this story, also relate to a Telegraph article regarding Rachel Riley condemning people flying Palestinian flags. So is the paper attempting to conflate Palestinian support for supporting the actions of Hamas? Because that's not what people are doing. A great many of us are aware of the plight of Palestine without supporting the violence we're seeing. But if you ignore a problem and people who are being oppressed want you to take notice, don't be surprised when violence is what you end up seeing. Naturally, when Hamas ends up on the cards, though, ends up in the media, they go running after Jeremy Corbyn, don't they? And of course, they haven't disappointed in that, with Channel 4's Paul McNamara having chased him down the street, asking Corbyn if he condemns Hamas. Now, Corbyn has already put out a statement saying, the unfolding events in Israel and Palestine are deeply alarming. We need an immediate ceasefire and de-escalation, and we need a route out of this tragic cycle of violence. Ending the occupation is the only means of achieving a just and lasting peace. But do you condemn Hamas, though? McNamara kept repeating endlessly on film going around on social media, no matter how many times Corbyn said he condemns both sides. Just what is it about our press that they are so tenured to what Israel are doing? Because the public isn't. With only 25% of the British public having been polled, having a favourable opinion of Israel. Of course, The Independent has gone after Corbyn as well for not condemning Hamas when he did. He just condemned Israel too. They had a debate on Good Morning Britain led by Red Tory Ed Balls attacking Corbyn as well, and so on and so forth. We're so familiar with it all by now, are we not? Worse, actually, I felt, was the treatment by our media of the head of Palestinian Mission UK, Hussam Zomlot. He did the media rounds, and every single interview began the same way. Will you condemn Hamas? Be it Channel 4, the BBC, Sky, whoever. The first question was always carried the same inference, that this is Palestine causing the trouble. Condemn it first, then the public will know Israel are the victims. Zumlot played it well despite his exasperation. In response to Cathy Newman of Channel 4, not his first interview, he said, Cathy, I have had this question as a first question in every interview I did, and I refuse to answer that question because it is the reason why we, as an international community, have failed to depict the situation as it is. This business of always being obsessed with blaming the victims, the occupied, the colonised, the besieged, when in fact I didn't see you ask about or condemn the killing of a family that your reporter just said about. Cathy Newman, in her typical way, just talked over that, still seeking a condemnation of the killing. That's a slightly different phrasing though, isn't it? Zumlot came back with that. It is tragic, and this has to stop. And this approach by international Western media has to stop also. There is no way we can draw symmetry. The one side that is responsible for this is the occupying power. You cannot draw symmetry between militant groups and what you call here in the West the only democracy in the Middle East. This isn't about Hamas. This isn't about the last 48 hours or what the Israelis have seen. My people have been seeing the same over a period of 75 years. This is about a Palestinian people, more than 13 million of us, that have been denied our very basic rights for almost half a century. And he's right. Hamas is the easiest thing to point at and condemn, and of course what they are doing is condemnable. But so is what Israel has been doing for the past 75 years since the Nakba, and before then too, leading up to that. Let's address that point on Hamas though. These are terrorist attacks, they say. It's an atrocity that they've killed innocents, we're told, and yes, it is. Hamas must be stopped. Well, Hamas, of course, came into being as a direct result of Israeli aggression against Palestine to begin with. If Russia, as a for instance, invaded the UK tomorrow and took your house away from you and killed your family, would you stand by and take it? Well, why would you expect anyone else to? Hamas are an Israeli-made problem, and if they want to deal with them, not treating Arabs as second-class citizens might be the way to start that. Israel isn't referred to as an apartheid state for fun. That's a term arrived at as a result of Israel denying Palestinians basic rights. And that's based on religion, and it's based on racism. And one of the biggest examples of the blatant apartheid on show is the law of return, which allows anyone of the Jewish faith, regardless of background, regardless of connections to the Israeli state anywhere in the world, to settle in Israel, claim citizenship there, no doubt on land stolen from Palestinians these days. It confers rights on Jews that it denies to Palestinians. There are 6 million people of Palestinian descent, those forced out by the Nakba, who are barred from returning in flagrant disregard of international law, I might add, which isn't being upheld. Palestinians only get access to water when allowed to, power when allowed to, can have no airport, can only come and go by the leave of Israelis. If that isn't being treated as a second-class citizen, if that isn't the very definition of apartheid, then I don't know what is. One of the favourite excuses I've seen bandied around is that Israel have offered Palestine land 5 times since Zionist rule. They can have 80% of the land and Israel will only settle in 20%, so said the Peel Commission Plan of 1937. We'll look at a map of settled status in that land and pull the other one. But the land Israel wanted was all of the fertile uplands and the coast. 20%, yeah, sure, but you wanted all the premium best land. The recent events were kicked off not by Hamas but by yet another Israeli attack as well, targeting a mosque of all places in Al-Aqsa on the 5th day of Sukkot, a week-long Muslim holiday, which took place on October the 4th, though it had been preceded by attacks since the previous Sunday. And this was all taking place at a place where even under Jewish law, Jews are forbidden to go. It was in a lot of ways the last straw for Palestine. Under international law, armed struggle is legitimate. We are, after all, watching Ukraine do just that against Russia, are we not? So why is it Palestine is not allowed to? Is the rest of the world treating them as second-class citizens as well? Well, blatantly, clearly we are. Israel is in breach of international law because it is an occupying power and has been occupying lands it should not have since 1967 when they invaded Palestinian territory and seized swathes of it, still doing so little by little to this day. Fighting to liberate that land cannot be wrong, can it? Holding on to it is, when it's not yours. So why are our leaders siding with the ones breaking international law instead of upholding it? Just how in hoc to Israel are various other governments around the world to behave as they are? Netanyahu has now declared a state of war and sent the army into Palestine. But when you consider Palestine doesn't actually have an army, who are they fighting? Fortunately, people are calling it out for what it is. Demonstrations around the country. Jewish bodies, notably the Orthodox Jewry, have been calling out the Israeli state and Zionist settlers for the crimes they are committing. Nobody wants to see the violence that is happen or continue, but it's going to for as long as Western governments and international communities continue to excuse Israel's occupation. It's apartheid, and supporting that, excusing Israel in a way nobody else would get away with, well, how is that right? What I want to see is the end of the occupation, a two-state solution that is meaningful and fair, that the human rights of Palestinians be met and adhered to. This was not a merely unprovoked attack by a terrorist group, when if it was the Azov battalion in Ukraine, they'd probably be referred to as freedom fighters instead. But not in Palestine, they get referred to as terrorists. A response to 75 years of oppression and occupation the rest of the world keeps turning a blind eye to. It's got to stop. Western democracies need to stop being held in some kind of thrall by Israel and act on their human rights and international law abuses, because there can be no peace in the region when you keep picking on the wrong side. Thanks for watching. I hope you found the video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where the Labour conference on right now has seen Keir Starmer censoring any mention of Israeli apartheid from the Palestine Solidarity Campaign stall there, and on their stall and in their literature, thus illustrating the scale of the problem we face in getting the truth out in this country. So is the case that our leaders are so poor and they keep following this pro-Israel narrative. And well, I'll hopefully see you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so there's been an audio recording, allegedly, of Keir Starmer having a sweary rant at an aide, allegedly over a missing tablet. And I was scratching my head at this yesterday and thinking to myself, do I want to cover this? Can I be sure about it? Is it just a bit of a prank? I listened to it a few times. The accounts saying it is a deep fake and AI generated, well, they might well be true. But I've read conflicting stories on this, with analyses saying that they think it is legitimate versus others saying no, it isn't. But the story has still gained sufficient traction that mainstream media and politicians have spoken out against it. And actually, with the reaction to it being what it has been, does it not actually speak volumes of Keir Starmer that so many believe it? Right, so have you heard the audio clip doing the rounds on social media of Keir Starmer apparently swearing at a 16-year-old intern about a missing tablet? It's quite the rant, a 25-second clip with 6 F-bombs and more. And if it was genuine, and if it was a 16-year-old child that he was speaking to like that, I'd want that addressed in sharpish, because that's absolutely disgusting. And for somebody that wants to run the country to address somebody like that, if it's real, he needs removing as leader in sharpish, because he in no way in heck is suited to running this country. It puts Gordon Brown's bigoted woman moment in the shade. Now, some people have run the audio through various analysis tools. I've read of acoustic experts feeling that this is genuine, that this is too good to be AI generated. And I'm not an acoustics expert by any means. I've got no reason to doubt their words and their opinions on this. And I must admit, having listened to plenty of AI generated videos and audio before, it does sound too good not to be real to me. But then I think about how much experience do I actually have of listening to deep fake material? And therefore I can't come down on one side or the other regarding the authenticity of the clip. There's other factors to consider too, though. The Twitter account that released it has a reputation for spreading disinformation. It's also quite a small account. But then I thought to myself, is that actually the point? Given the content, it ought to be incredulous to think anyone in a position of responsibility could address a staffer in such a way. But when it came to Keir Starmer, it was instantly believable. Although given that it is all of 25 seconds, a few have dismissed it as fake on the grounds they can't believe he could speak for that long without mentioning his father was a toolmaker. Now, I appreciate my opinion of him is already a low one. But with the media picking the story up, actually Didn't matter if it was fake or not, as all the mainstream media were telling us. They'd highlighted it, got people talking about it, so they've ended up helping to spread it, even as they sought to close it down in their own minds. Surely they knew it was better to ignore it if it were fake news. Apparently not. Perhaps it was more of a paranoid circling of the wagons on behalf of the establishment's next anointed one. How quickly were they to exonerate Starmer of any involvement in Jimmy Savile, for example? Why did they refuse repeatedly to address Starmer's connections with the incarceration and ongoing attempts at deportation of Julian Assange? There's a whiff of coordination in the air about it all. Sky News' Sophie Ridge tweeted out, "This is a very troubling glimpse into how AI is changing politics. The audio has been all over my timeline. I agree it's a threat to democracy." Tory MP Simon Clarke said, "There is a deepfake audio circulating this morning of Keir Starmer. Ignore it. It's a reminder why the upcoming AI summit organised by the Prime Minister is so important." And this was reinforced by ITV News' Paul Brand, who quoted Clarke's tweet saying, "So encouraging to see politicians on all sides of the Commons calling out deep fakes, which are one of the greatest threats to democracy." Well, how was it verified to be a deep fake then? How was a Tory MP so sure about it? Did they produce it? There's been no explanation of how it has been ruled as such. Who said so? Who has made the definitive ruling on this? How has this been demonstrated and proven? Questions hang in the air about it, despite media and even opposition political voices coming out to defend Starmer. Yet we can easily believe he said this. Previous actions have shown him to be a petulant, vengeful, small-minded little man, from the purges of the left from the party to right-wing takeovers locally up and down the country, the mistreatment of members and other politicians, notably Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott, his control freakery. Yes, this audio is completely believable of a man who can act as we know Starmer has. And so now we're talking about it, now that we're asking questions of the sort of person he is, does it matter if it's fake or not when we believe this genuinely is the sort of person Starmer could be, whether he actually said it or not? It isn't a stretch to believe that he could have said all this to a staffer. It's not a stretch to imagine him saying these things to an underling, and even if he came out and denied it, which he hasn't, nobody at time of writing from Labour has actually stood up and confirmed it to be a fake. Starmer's lied about so much, about so many other things. Would we believe him even if he did deny it? That aside, if AI audio is getting this good, spells problems during elections, especially in light of recent events in Slovakia. You see, Slovakia went to the polls at the end of last month, but 2 days before polls opened, an audio clip, purportedly to be between the leader of the Progressive Slovakia Party and a newspaper journalist, discussed how to rig an election, come out. Although this was also decided to be a deep fake by French news agency AFP, who have also said likewise about the Starmer recording, it posed a problem for the press in Slovakia because the leak came right at the beginning of a 48-hour moratorium, effectively a period of purdah, where no political discussion could take place. It came out via Meta, Facebook, getting around a loophole where they only act against faked videos. By being audio only, the alleged fake got through. Now we're seeing that with this Starmer clip too. Audio only. That has to be said. The long and the short of it is that AI manipulation can produce very realistic clips. Sound clips, certainly, which may not be true. We can no longer trust our ears as well as our eyes anymore in this era of faking it. But given the media will happily embark on making up their own news when it suits them already, are they actually fit to be arbiters over this? I remember when a Corbyn aide was accused of punching someone rather than it actually being just a case of somebody cycling into another person's outstretched arm, but that did the rounds too in an effort to damage reputation and harm electability. And it certainly wasn't AI that put a Russian-style hat on Corbyn on Newsnight either, was it? So whether AI gets acted upon is largely a moot point when you can't trust establishment media anyway. And if something strikes you as believable about someone, as in this case with Keir Starmer, well, it doesn't say a lot about the person that this is how many people do actually see you. Do you actually believe that this is how you would conduct yourself? That's something Starmer and what passes for his fan base really ought to reflect on. What do you make of this story, though? Will AI fakes become a bigger thing, or is this just shenanigans by someone? Do you think it's real or fake? Do you think it matters? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below and be part of the conversation. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where the Confettigate story surrounding George Osborne's wedding a few months back seemed to be a story blown up out of all proportion as the press buried all other news in their pursuit of a mystery woman throwing orange confetti at the happy couple, which conveniently distracted from some rather more disturbing allegations about Osborne that came out just prior to that wedding, thus showing news is what they want you to hear and not what you need to know. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so possibly the most sinister bit of news coming out of the Israel-Palestine conflict currently underway has actually come out of Egypt, because Egyptian intelligence officials are saying that they warned Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that something big was coming from Hamas, yet were repeatedly ignored. Now, Egypt remains a neutral party in this, even though they are an Arab country. They act as intermediaries often between Israel and Palestine to reduce the likelihood of conflict. Yet Netanyahu has dismissed any notion of Egyptian warnings, calling it fake news. Well, what incentive is there for Egypt to lie? Netanyahu, on the other hand, if he is lying about being warned, has therefore allowed this conflict we're seeing now to begin, and everything that has come to pass thus far, the deaths and the injuries on both sides that have happened and will come to pass yet, is on him. And that's truly psychopathic. Right, so Egyptian intelligence have said they had been warning Israel and their leader Benjamin Netanyahu of something big coming from Hamas for 10 days leading up to the start of the conflict. Yet Netanyahu is denying any of it, calling it fake news, not anything factually accurate. The thing is, Egypt have no reason to lie about such things. If anything, they've an incentive to make the warnings since they share a checkpoint border with the Gaza Strip. And any warfare conducted against Gaza will result in Palestinians amassing at that Egyptian checkpoint, wanting to escape, wanting to enter Egypt to do so. 2.3 million people live in Gaza. A lot of people for Egypt to have to deal with, so it was very much in their interest to act as intermediaries, make these warnings, and yet Israel appeared to have completely ignored them. Why, though? Did Netanyahu just want an excuse to bomb the living daylights out of Gaza? Seems a bit difficult to come to another conclusion, especially going by the guy's past record. But that's not even the whole story here, because if true, that means he was perfectly content for his own Israeli citizens to be targeted as well, injured and killed by Hamas, in order to get that excuse. Now, for those of us who have seen social media footage of Israelis gleefully celebrating the deaths of Palestinians as they do, this isn't such a hard thing to believe, and if true, would make Israel a leading obstacle to achieving world peace. Also, when you listen to the words of those in Netanyahu's government on such things, it isn't hard to believe this either. One notable piece of video footage featured Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant saying, "We are imposing a complete siege on Gaza. There will be no electricity, no food, no water, and no fuel. Everything will be closed. We are fighting against human animals, and we are acting accordingly." No, you aren't. You're punishing innocent Palestinians for the actions of Hamas. But that isn't the same thing. Also, referring to them all as human animals is not only the language of the far right, it dehumanizes them, reinforcing the growing global belief and understanding that Israel is an apartheid state and that Palestinians are degraded, are treated as second-class citizens, do have to live by a different set of rules to everyone else. Also, where is the fallout from this amongst our politicians who are falling over themselves right now to offer their unconditional support to Israel and to Israelis, especially if it turns out Netanyahu did know all about this in advance and let his own people be targeted as some kind of an excuse to go to war in Gaza? Half the population of Gaza, incidentally, are kids. They're kids because the life expectancy there is so low. They're not Hamas, they're children. So who are they fighting? And there have been some properly sick examples of how UK politicians are reacting to this war and ignoring inhuman actions such as cutting off the water supply. There's even worse than that being said, though. Another member of Netanyahu's party in the Knesset, a backbencher in effect, tweeted out, Jericho missile, strategic alert, before considering the introduction of forces, doomsday weapon. This is my opinion. May God preserve all our strength. Nuclear weapons. Bomb the living daylights out of Gaza and wipe it off the face of the earth. Utterly psychopathic, and all our governments appear to do is fall over themselves to defend these people and stand with them. James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, when confronted by what Yoav Gallant said, totally ignored the suffering it caused by saying, Israel has a right to defend itself against attack. The UK supports Israel in defending itself proportionately. The truth of the matter is that this was a terrorist attack perpetrated by Hamas, who are embedded in Gaza, shielding themselves amongst the Palestinian people. So does Palestine under international law as an occupied territory, and Hamas came into being as a result of that. This is our Foreign Secretary, folks, the guy who should know the bloody obvious, demonstrating why Hamas came into existence, because if you ignore the fact Israel is in violation of international law, yet hide behind those same laws in order to protect them, those who feel abandoned will no longer take the democratic and civilized route, because all it does is consistently fail them. You want to deal with Hamas? You want to stop the killing? Then take Israel to task for their crimes instead of pretending this is such a one-sided issue. What cleverly is defending here? Defending the right to punish civilians by denying them the basics, the water, the food, the fuel, which he totally ignored in his response, is called collective punishment, and under international law is a war crime. That's what he just supported. The people affected most are not the ones engaging with Israel with violence. Violence that gets revisited upon them tenfold, and will here deny them even a basic right such as water. For God's sake, man. He wasn't done. He wasn't even done with this. He was gushing over Israeli ambassador to the UK, Zippy Hatobali, a woman who has said of the siege it isn't Israel's job to look after Palestinian people, despite them having the means to turn the taps off to water, food, fuel and energy. But it is now Hamas's job to do that, presumably magicking all of these resources out of thin air. But then she's also on record as having said there is no such thing as the Palestinian people. That she should be our Israeli representative just shows how desperately in hock to the Israeli state our government here in the UK has become, how deep the collusion is. And it won't improve with Labour in charge either, with the idiot, likely future Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, happily saying Gaza isn't occupied by Israel, ignoring all the land grabbing still going on, all the land stolen in the 1967 war. That's all occupied territory, Rachel, and by the way, Gaza is occupied too, otherwise people could come and go freely and have their own means of power, water and production, instead of it being a literal prison complex, you absolute dunce. Well, the fallout from all of this has seen people amassing at the Egyptian border. In fact, Israel has advised Palestinians head there, ahead of them conducting further retaliative action. But surely you could argue they are just penning those people into a smaller area, making them more of a tempting target. Why won't Egypt open its border then, you might be thinking? Well, rather than being the neutral party, properly neutral party they are being portrayed to be, and as I've alluded to already, Egypt are not opening their borders even to save lives, it would seem, and actually are seen by many Palestinians as collaborators. If the people gathering at the border get targeted by Israel, will they change tack or will they see these people die? I guess that would give us our answer, but they certainly aren't letting people through right now unless they can pay the entrance fees, and Egypt just raised the price. 50% of Palestinians in Gaza are unemployed. They happen to be children, as I already alluded to, so they're trapped. There's a reason the Gaza Strip is referred to as the largest open-air prison on the planet, and Egypt are on guard duty, as well as Israel. However, having said that, news broke just this morning that Egypt will start allowing Palestinians through at a rate of 2,000 per day. So it'll only take 3 years to empty Gaza at that rate. I'm sure Netanyahu will wait, of course, before bombing them. The Gaza Strip is one of the most crowded places on earth. It's not a big place. Israel has provided no humanitarian corridor itself, something Egypt is demanding it do, before threatening to attack and kill more people. It has simply relied on an erstwhile ally to let people through and consider that enough. Egypt don't, as I've just said, but again it all lends credence to this view that Netanyahu has engineered this situation in order to eradicate Gazan Palestinians. Once again, it is treating people like they are less than human, violating international law, not that they weren't already doing that with their illegal occupation, and there's another land grab in the offing here because all those global politicians making excuses for Israel right now will find it a pretty tough sell to justify Israel taking over the Gaza Strip in its entirety, as I can completely see happening. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Please do have your say on what we are seeing here in the comments below and be part of the conversation. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where not only have Keir Starmer's Labour refused to call out Israeli apartheid, but actually they have a donor strongly connected to South African apartheid, underlining just what a sick organisation that party is under the current leadership. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so several of the mainstream news outlets today are running front page stories on a truly appalling set of events. Daily Express, the Metro, the Murdoch Media, the Eye, the Independent, the Telegraph, the Mail, all of them alleging that some 40 babies had been murdered by Hamas, including some of them having been beheaded. Here's the problem with this, though, and the really big problem with how our UK print media and TV media who are talking about it as well. None of this has been verified. Even the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, have not confirmed this story after apparently having been asked 3 times by Sky to do so. So why is it an unconfirmed, unverified report is being peddled as fact when it clearly hasn't been proven? Just how chronically untrustworthy and awful do our press have to prove themselves to be once again before more people start asking questions about what they're being told and what exactly do we actually know in regards to these allegations? Right. So it's been on the news, it must be true. Even when the reporter says the reports on these baby murders are unverified, it doesn't matter, because just the mere fact it's being talked about registers in a lot of people's minds something about it. It must be true. That gets backed up when so many of our mainstream papers will carry that same story and have been carrying that same story on their front pages as if it is irrefutable fact, thus hardening more people against Palestine, which is being deliberately conflated with Hamas, despite the two not being the same. For example, our fascistic Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, looks set to criminalise the flying of Palestinian flags, despite Hamas having their own flag. But don't talk about that, Suella, will you? But let's not worry about little details that might be important like that. Sticking with a Sky News theme, though, but scraping the barrel bottom all the more, was the conduct of Kay Burley yesterday on the media narrative towards Palestine. He was interviewing the hapless James Cleverly, who has been falling over himself, fawning over Israeli diplomats and pledging himself to an apartheid state, when Burley asked him, "What do you think about your opposite number David Lammy sharing a platform with the Palestinian ambassador who has basically said the Israelis had it coming? Would you share a platform with him about teeing up a Tory with an opportunity not only to attack Palestine but attack Labour too?" Well done, Kay. An hour later, Burley was interviewing Labour MP Stella Creasy and went from Hussam Zomlot, that ambassador, basically saying what she had alleged when interviewing James Cleverly, to that Israel had it coming, to claiming it was what he actually said. Burley has been torn to shreds on social media over her conduct because that Palestinian ambassador, Hussam Zomlot, never said any such thing. And in her typical arrogant, "I'm a journalist, you don't know what you're talking about, I do" fashion, has been chipping back at those pointing at her dishonesty, notably Michael Walker and Aaron Bastani of Novara Media, who clearly touched a nerve with Burley telling both to stop messaging her. Not even honest in that response, as they'd actually only tagged her in their responses to her actions on Twitter, with Walker calling Burley a playground shit stirrer, which I thought a touch unfair. The playground is a lot more professional. Burley wasn't the only one, though. Andrew Neil put out a tweet saying, "Unconfirmed reports that Hamas has slaughtered 40 babies, beheading some, increasingly and sadly looking like being true. Major news outlets now carrying the reports. The English language does not contain the vocabulary for an adequate response to..." Actually, it does. It's called "Get the facts right before reporting something is increasingly looking like being true," because nothing has changed since last night. Former BBC newsman John Sobel quote-tweeted Neil saying, "Dear friends and former colleagues at BBC News, if this doesn't describe an act of pure terror by terrorists, what does? The guidelines that I followed for years are no longer fit for purpose and sadly have the effect of sanitizing." This was a swipe at the BBC referring to Hamas as militants and not terrorists in their news bulletins, as per their guidelines. But again, that argument is excusing the actions of Israel, the land occupation and apartheid that has driven this violent response, because nobody in the rest of the world notices until violence erupts. There are even more mainstream voices saying the same thing here. Neil, incidentally, has also said he doesn't believe in Israeli apartheid. He thinks it's a left-wing propaganda meme. So quite frankly, why anyone takes notice of what that ridiculous little man says anymore is beyond me. He acts like Hamas do this for kicks and totally ignores the established history of the region and the treatment we see every day happening if we choose to look, because sadly it doesn't get mainstreamed, thanks to people like Andrew Neil. But what is the truth of the matter? What do we know? Well, the Sky News last night in their media rounds happened to mention this story comes from one Israeli journalist that she was told, apparently, by Israeli soldiers that at least 40 babies had been murdered in Kfar Aza. The journalist in question, Nicole Zedek, works for I24 News, which is an Israeli-based news channel, so hardly impartial. I checked out Zedek's Twitter account. She has interviews with soldiers on there. That she has clips of her interviewing them. They do talk of beheadings. They do mention children and women, but none mention babies specifically. In fact, the only person who does in any of the clips on her page is Zedek herself. Now, in no way am I belittling the violence and atrocity here. It's horrible. I absolutely condemn it. But isn't that what Zedek should be doing too, rather than, as it appears, as these reports regarding babies remain unverified, made up? And the longer that goes on, the more it looks like it's been made up. The I24 news channel itself is basically the Israeli version of Al Jazeera in that it broadcasts worldwide in all manner of languages. Nicole Zedek works for I24 English, for example. And actually a lot of the problems with the impartiality and reputation of this channel come from getting that English-speaking channel. According to a Haaretz investigation in 2018, I24 wasn't doing very well. And to improve their prospects, they wanted an English-speaking channel to broadcast in Israel, as well as a local news channel to broadcast in Hebrew. And in order to get these things, they decided the best way to do this was to kiss the backside of Benjamin Netanyahu as hard as they possibly could. In their bid to get what they wanted, I24 went along with the wishes of Netanyahu, which included banning former regular guests, cancelling any programme deemed too leftist, and even having a say over staffing. What this has resulted in, according to one former executive that Haaretz interviewed, is a news station that isn't so much pro-Israel, but pro-Benjamin Netanyahu. So the only source reporting the murder and beheadings of at least 40 babies is the word of one journalist who works for one Israeli channel which is seen as Netanyahu propagandists. Fortunately, it isn't the only source we have to rely on in actively pursuing the truth behind the story. Where our media here have just been repeating the allegations I24 have made, Turkey-based Anadolu Agency have literally spoken to the Israeli army itself over this matter, and they are saying they have had no confirmation of the allegations made that Hamas beheaded babies. The response from the Israeli army spokesperson unit, as they have reported it, quotes them as saying, "We have seen the news, but we do not have any details or confirmation about them." If that confirmation does eventually come, those who committed such a heinous act deserve to be dealt with accordingly. Of course they do. Obviously they do. But by not even waiting for that, our media are showing the side they picked in this confrontation. And it doesn't matter how it began or why it began, because it doesn't matter if Israel are committing apartheid and treating people like animals and keeping them in what is in effect an open-air prison. It doesn't matter that Israel last night attacked the checkpoint between Gaza and Egypt to prevent people leaving Gaza that way. As I reported in my video yesterday on this, that Egypt were allowing people from Gaza to escape into Egypt. It doesn't matter that US troops are about to get involved. It doesn't matter that whilst we talk of Israeli babies getting killed, a genocide looks like it's about to take place, and half the population of Gaza happen to be children themselves. Even if this atrocity does get proven true, it doesn't justify doing it in Gaza as well in return. The UN has warned Israel that military action must be conducted in accordance with humanitarian law and to protect civilians, but they've turned the water and the electricity off, so they're blatantly in violation of that already. Why would any of us believe they won't just wipe Gaza off the face of the earth? And what then, UN? Shrug your shoulders, slap wrists and forget about it all again, otherwise you'll get accused of being anti-Semites? That seems to be the attitude towards Israel every time, doesn't it? We're being told to believe Israel good, Palestine bad. Israel, the occupiers, are somehow freedom fighters, and Palestinian, the occupied territory, and the occupied people are the terrorists. We're being softened up to accept something truly fearful or face being criminalised here in the UK by our own government if we disagree, as Braverman has implied, and tried to show solidarity with Palestine by waving a flag. Stories like this one, narratives so harrowing that we fear to dispute them, lest we look bad ourselves, still need to be proven. And we should be demanding that as a minimum and not be cowed by what others might think of us, who are sucked in by shamelessness being sold to us as journalism, by people not worthy of the name. Equally as bad are our government as this claim about these babies has even been retweeted by the Minister of State for Security, Tom Tugendhat. Facts matter. Facts need to be established. And that should be done before any reporting happens. Surely that's obvious. Let alone front pages be dominated by it.
Thanks for watching. I hope you found the video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Do leave a comment below and have your say on this story too and be part of the conversation. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where Egyptian intelligence reports state that Benjamin Netanyahu had been informed of the impending strike from Hamas ahead of time and allowed his people to be hit, it seems, for some ulterior motive. So if true, aren't all the deaths, regardless of the age of the victims, on him too? And I'll hopefully see you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so wasn't Keir Starmer's face a picture? And a protester stormed the stage conveniently right before he began speaking to Labour conference and threw glitter all over him. Security eventually got on stage and pulled the guy away. Starmer took off his jacket, rolled his sleeves up and said, "Protest or power, that's why we changed our party." And I thought that's too quick and off the cuff for Starmer. He is the human form of Zolpidem to come out with. And then there were t-shirts being sold on the Labour Party website within hours. Is it just me, or does anyone else think this was a big setup? Right, so Keir Starmer's big conference speech, it got off to a somewhat unusual start, didn't it? Random guy runs on stage, throws glitter all over Starmer and says, "True democracy is citizen-led. Politics needs an update. We demand the people count." It's a really odd comment, actually. You can kind of hazard a guess at what he was on about, but it wasn't well conveyed. Most protesters who run on stage can at least string a cogent sentence together. They'll have rehearsed it. They know they don't have very long to get their piece out, knowing what they're on about. Starmer pretends this sort of people's politics is what he's all about, though, as long as they don't get a say at the end of the day, obviously. So surely this fellow would have been better off going after Sunak at Tory conference. Although if he's of the same opinion as I am, and many of you watching are in regards to Keir Starmer's relationship with the truth and with honesty, I suppose it wasn't a bad place to make his point, all things said. It's not like Starmer was in any rush to get away from the chap, though, was he? He did grab Starmer's arm, I suppose, but he didn't look particularly worried. He just looked annoyed. The security then bundled the guy off, carted him away, and Starmer just took his jacket off, dusted himself down, tried to sound all tough by saying, "If he thinks that's going to put me off, he doesn't know me very well," to cheers from the assembled Blairite delegates, because there's no left-wing ones left, surely. Nobody knows you very well, Keith. What you stand for in the morning might have changed completely by the evening. The entire incident bugged me, though. How did the guy get in and get so close to Starmer? Last year, if you remember Labour conference from then, security was so tight there were armed security walking up and down the aisles, weren't there? Nobody could breathe the wrong way without being noticed. So how did this guy get on stage, have a good 5 seconds or so to say his piece before being unceremoniously taken away? Starmer got asked by Kay Burley what was going through his mind at the time, and I have a feeling it was more, make it look good, rather than, who the hell is this idiot, which would have been a more honest appraisal. Starmer's response to the question was neither of those things, though, as it turned out. Instead, he claimed he was thinking, "We have worked for 4 years to get the Labour Party to a position where I could speak not just to the room, but to the country, and I was not going to let that idiot deflect me." Interesting go-to response when being grabbed from behind and covered in glitter. I don't buy it for one moment. Who would still be thinking along those lines? I'd be more concerned the guy had something a lot worse than glitter on him. A wishing I'd worn the brown trousers this morning moment, but not Starmer, apparently, hard as nails. His comment afterwards about protest or power, that's why we've changed the Labour Party, wasn't lost on me either. The entire Labour movement was born out of protest, but now power's all that matters, apparently. Power to do what, though? Change stuff that you used to protest about? No, don't be silly. You don't believe in protest, do you? You want to change things people are protesting about now, even though you once promised to. Now you won't do anything the Tories won't do, will you? Tory child poverty cap is here to stay. Tory house building targets being adopted. Tory austerity is going to remain. Tory privatisation, we're not reversing any of that. Tory ruined NHS, let's add some more private healthcare in for good measure. All will apparently just stay exactly the same under Labour now. With even Tories calling much of this out, claiming Labour is stealing their thunder, and that's one hell of a depth to sink to, isn't it? Protests, though, standing on picket lines, no. That's a sackable offence under Labour now. We know it is. We've seen it. Labour seeking power, but not to do anything differently with it. Raising my suspicions further, though, was the sudden appearance of £20 t-shirts with "Sparkle with Starmer" emblazoned across the front of them. I can't imagine anything like that would be ratified by the party and put into production in so small a time frame. Starmer's far too much of a control freak to do that, surely. But hey, perhaps it can, or perhaps it was all just pre-arranged. But if you think this makes Starmer look more appealing, then think again. Because you can't polish a turd, but you can certainly cover one in glitter. Besides, why use glitter anyway? Doesn't everyone else get covered in orange paint these days? What happened to eggs or oil? That was usually the go-to ammo of choice for a politician to cover a face full of. Glitter brushes off very nicely, very conveniently. If this was a setup to allow somebody to storm the stage and pull a stunt to sell a few t-shirts and make Starmer look cool under pressure, then it was pretty tacky and actually pretty offensive. Letting people get this close to MPs has not gone down well in the past. We will always remember what happened to Joe Cox, of course. But it was only 2 years ago, notably in October as well, that David Ames was murdered at a constituency surgery. So if this was a stunt, it was an incredibly poor taste. And for what? To make Starmer look like he has a personality? We know he hasn't got one. No amount of glitter can change that. No amount of glitter can add any colour for the more than hour-long bore-fest of a speech that followed. I don't buy into it. I still think Starmer's a snake, a Tory masquerading in Labour clothing. And though he's a charisma-deficient liar, trying to pull a stunt to make himself look good to desperately deflect from that. What he failed to grasp was that the moment he opened his mouth, ordinary people, not the Blairite rump of delegates clapping loudly like seals, obviously, were instantly reminded of why they can't stand him, though. And the fact we can believe so easily that he would pre-arrange this means he's gained little from it except ridicule. Labour remain in a commanding polling lead because people hate the Tories. This is just another reminder of why that polling lead really does have nothing to do with Keir Starmer. Thanks for watching. I hope you found the video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Please do leave a comment and be part of the conversation on this. Also, do you believe it was legit or was it a stunt? Do tell me why. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where another borefest, the supposed economic brains behind Labour, Rachel Reeves, recently gave us 4 reasons to dump Labour. No amount of glitter will put a glint on this either, and I'll hopefully see you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.
Right, so Keir Starmer and Emily Thornberry, most notably amongst our politicians, it has to be said, possibly because both of them are lawyers. Thornberry, a former Shadow Foreign Secretary, as well as the current Shadow Attorney General. Starmer, arguably most pertinently, being a former human rights lawyer, who again demonstrating he probably wasn't a very good one, as both are unable, it seems, to call a war crime, are unable to state in no uncertain terms that collective punishment, which Israel are meting out on Palestine when they are supposedly targeting Hamas, yet are widely killing hundreds of civilians indiscriminately, it seems, as they do so. Terrorist acts on both sides need to be called exactly that. You cannot pick and choose whose human rights you value more. Who are you to do that? Yet that seems to be the Labour position. The position of others too, who I will make mention of, and yes, there absolutely is fallout from this from within the Labour Party too, horrified by their leadership's response. Right, so anyone else sick of the words Israel has a right to defend itself, becoming the rote response from our politicians and media collective talking heads? Collective responsibility in supporting collective punishment seems to be the attitude. And Keir Starmer has exemplified that better than most of the last couple of days. His devotion to Israel comes without equivocation, as we know, is unquestioning, and that seemingly supersedes the fact he was a human rights lawyer. Though, of course, that has always depended on whose human rights, because he has got a history of picking and choosing. He never gave a second thought for the human rights of Julian Assange, for instance, as he went above and beyond at the CPS to try and get him deported to Sweden, telling Swedish officials do not get cold feet. There was that US extradition virtually guaranteed to happen afterwards, wasn't there? There was no apparent consideration for the human rights of Jean-Charles de Menezes, an unarmed man shot dead after a botched Met Police operation overseen by the later Met Police Commissioner, Cressida Dick, when he let her off the hook, seemingly on the grounds it would have damaged her career. Look at what the Met has become under her watch. What a pity her career didn't get stunted, a lot of people might be thinking. So should we really be surprised when he says in no uncertain terms he supports war crimes as long as it is Israel committing them, because that is okay? Nick Ferrari on LBC asked Keir Starmer, a siege is appropriate, cutting off power, cutting off water security, to which he received the answer,
I think that Israel does have that right. It is an ongoing situation. Obviously, everything should be done within international law, but I don't want to step away from the sort of core principles that Israel has a right to defend herself, and Hamas bears responsibility for these terrorist acts, and I would call on all responsible states, particularly Middle East responsible states, to call this out for what it is and to stand with the world in condemning these actions by Hamas. First things first, if you had an ounce of a clue about what was going on, you absolute balloon of a man, you would know that the surrounding states are all Muslim, all Arab states, and they've historically always supported Palestine. Egypt, notably, has always been a go-between between Israel and Palestine, and they've been going in with packs on their backs, people from Egypt voluntarily taking food and water into Gaza, despite the fact that Egyptian-Gaza border has just been bombed. If Israel has a right to defend herself, let's consider that, though, in its most basic terms here. Because if that's the case, then so does Palestine. Just because the West refuses to recognise a Palestinian state doesn't make it untrue. And as occupied territory under international law, you quote, but clearly do not understand, they have the right to defend themselves with violence if needs be. In no way does that make me a supporter of Hamas or of the killings they are responsible for. They should be condemned just as much as Israeli killings are, because both are equally wrong. But don't try and excuse the politics and the actions that have brought us to this point, because the likes of Hamas, the likes of Hezbollah in Lebanon, came into being as a direct consequence of Israeli invasion and atrocity. They exist because of Israel and because of their past conduct. And Starmer can gloss over that at every turn if he likes, and he absolutely will. I don't think there is another UK politician more devoted to Israel than he is, but it doesn't change the facts. But the most disturbing thing of all that he said was that Israel are within their rights to cut off power and water, which is collective punishment, and is itself a war crime. It is illegal, and a war crime under the same international law he also brought up, making it abundantly obvious he isn't familiar with it, and as a human rights lawyer, he really ought to be. That or he is, and knows he's talking rubbish, and he's going to carry on doing it anyway. Because surely this is one of the basics he should know as a human rights lawyer. Just how crap of a lawyer was he if he didn't know that, and how nasty and vindictive a politician he is if he does. If he doesn't understand collective punishment is a war crime, well, he isn't the only politician falling into that trap, though. And I'm not going to exclusively pick on Labour here, but I am going to address Emily Thornberry too, the Shadow Attorney General, next, because again, she's a lawyer. She's in a judicial shadow ministerial post. And her interview on Newsnight I thought slightly different, because the look on her face told me she knew what she was saying was drivel, but she was basically willingly selling her soul for a future ministerial car and going along with Starmer's apparent ignorance anyway. She got the Victoria Derbyshire treatment on Newsnight, and she was confronted with the Geneva Convention of 1949, although Derbyshire referenced Protocols 1 and 2, which were passed in 1977, enhancing the protections of civilians, which of course is the relevant international law we're all talking about here. Though whether this was what Starmer was referring to, I can't say. His apparent ignorance of it all, I doubt he could have named it if he'd been asked to. Anyway, Article 54 thereof of the Geneva Convention, Protocols 1 and 2 applied, states, starvation of civilians as a method of warfare is prohibited. Derbyshire asked her, in light of her obvious familiarity with this act, being a lawyer herself, was Starmer right in saying Israel had the right to cut off power and water to Palestine? Well, Thornberry just came out with Israel are the victims, and that overused line, which is getting on my tripe now, which is Israel has the right to defend itself. That planes can't land in Tel Aviv. Well, that's because Israeli airspace has to be cleared for Israel to use its Iron Dome defence system, itself allegedly now compromised. That's a rabbit hole to go down as to how you believe that might have happened. But not once would she say Israel did or did not have the right to cut off power and water. 3 times Derbyshire asked her. 3 times she danced the politician's dance and answered another question entirely. Utterly shameful. She should be embarrassed, because in her case, I truly believe she does know better. I think she's too afraid of being sacked by Starmer if she told the truth and said otherwise. Others are far less shameless, though. Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, let's will in the Tories here. He's always a national source of shame as well. Israel have, as many will already know, ordered the entirety of Gaza City, the northernmost largest settlement in the Gaza Strip, to be evacuated of its 1.1 million inhabitants within 24 hours. It's literally half the population of Gaza, already one of the most densely populated parts of the world, to move into the south of the Strip, doubling the overcrowding. It's not like people can escape from the south either, because Israel has already bombed the access to Egypt via the Rafah border crossing. This I'm going to go into in another video, I think. There's too much to say on this in just in this video as well. But back to Shapps. His response to this insane evacuation diktat and whether our government supports the order led to him saying, yes, that line again, Israel has the right to defend itself. That sentence has become the go-to excuse for anything, but keeps ignoring the fact Palestine has the same right and they're an occupied territory. Israel has been in violation of international law itself for decades by occupying and seizing land that is not theirs, covered in Geneva Convention Articles 42 through to 56, incidentally. Though admittedly occupation isn't very well defined in it, weirdly enough, possibly why Israel has got away with it for so long. Other politicians have come out to bat for Israel too, however. Ursula von der Leyen of the EU is one, despite the collective punishment being meted out. Interestingly enough, last year when Russia attempted this in Ukraine, though, she tweeted out, Russia's attacks against civilian infrastructure, especially electricity, are war crimes. Cutting off men, women and children of water, electricity and heating, with winter coming, these are acts of pure terror, and we have to call it as such. Well, you won't, now it's Palestine, though, will you? Speaking of Ukraine, though, Volodymyr Zelensky is another, considering a trip to Israel in solidarity, it is being reported. But in response to his own country being attacked by Putin, he was quite vociferous on Twitter too, saying, there must be no famine, the right to food and clean water should be the basic human right, it must be a global goal. Anyone who tries to deprive people of food or water is an enemy to humanity. We must defeat such enemies like Ukraine and our partners. I strongly suggest you don't visit Israel then, if that's how you really feel. The BBC let us down repeatedly this week with all the war coverage going on. They've just had their front doors defaced with red paint because of it. They chose to platform on Question Time this week, of all people, Jake Wallace-Simons, the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, an avowedly pro-Zionist newspaper, who got called out on the show over a tweet he put out, which he had the brass neck to still deny. But in this era of screenshots, he can't get away with saying. And he indeed said, we need to face reality. Much of Muslim culture is in the grip of a death cult that sacralises bloodshed. Not all, but many Muslims are brainwashed by it. This is a big part of the problem. Islamophobic much? But that's fine to platform on the BBC because he'll be out to bat for Israel. Nonetheless, there are those who have spoken out and railed against what is desperately trying to be promoted as the mainstream national narrative, let's call it, not least of which millions of people, it seems, up and down this country today, marching in the streets, London, Newcastle, Sheffield, Liverpool, more places than that, with Palestinian flags, giving Suella Braverman a big flip of the bird to her narrative that people flying that flag, it should be criminalised and arrested. Far be it from me, though, to want to give a Tory props over all of that, though. But Alicia Kearns, a backbencher, has tweeted out in response to reports that Israel has been using white phosphorus. And she said, white phosphorus use in densely populated civilian areas is a war crime. Why? Because it effectively rains down fire, because of how indiscriminate it is, and because it is so very difficult to extinguish. It sticks to skin and burns deep, even through human bone and metal. Multiple news agencies have reported that this is happening. It needs confirming, because if so, that's yet another war crime. Starmer and Thornberry have both been publicly embarrassed too, as the BAME officer of Young Labour, Lubaba Khalid, herself a Palestinian, resigned with a scathing letter, reading, it is with a heavy heart that today I have handed in my resignation from my role as Young Labour BAME officer. As a Palestinian with direct family in Gaza, I am absolutely appalled by the comments made to LBC by the leader of the Labour Party and my local MP, Keir Starmer, who said that Israel has the right to withhold water and electricity. Collective punishment is a war crime under international law. This position was then reaffirmed by Emily Thornberry. I have spent the last few days worried about the safety of my family, and with the electricity now cut off and communication limited, these worries are only exacerbated. I have received zero support from the Labour Party, a common theme experienced by other Muslim and Palestinian members. The comments from the leadership this week have been the last straw. I can only conclude that the Labour Party is no longer a safe space for Palestinians and Muslims. She's hardly the first Muslim to say that. That's damning, though. That letter is absolutely scathing. In amongst far too many really poorly judged, really terrible commentaries on this ongoing mess in the Middle East, Starmer's has to be amongst the worst. A human rights lawyer it would appear with no idea that collective punishment is a war crime. But it shouldn't actually even take a legal background to recognise that punishing civilians for the actions of others is wrong. 2.3 million people in the Gaza Strip, and it's okay to punish them all while siding with their oppressors just to put the boot in that little bit more. Since 2008, some 156,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza and the West Bank. Some 6,000 Israelis have died in that time as well. So it's hardly even-handed. It's hardly a fair fight. But every one of those deaths, regardless of which side they happened on, is as tragic as it was preventable. It's no good siding with Israel come hell or high water, as Starmer seems intent on, because it's giving the green light to genocide if boundaries and laws put in place to prevent it are not upheld, as seems to be the very real danger here. Thanks for watching. I hope you found the video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Do also leave a comment and be part of the conversation on all of this as well. Do have your say. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where the comparisons and hypocrisy being exposed on the Israel-Palestine conflict versus that going on in Ukraine hasn't been lost on some, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.